Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to make the Olympia pullover by Pattern Niche. It's one of my favourite things to make because it's super simple and you can use it for going to the gym, for yoga, for wearing at the beach. But before we start, if you just hit subscribe down below, you can see lots of great videos with so many sewing tips. Now, there's lots of different versions you can make. There's shirt length, tunic length, scoop hood, standard hood. I've just made the standard hood, but if you follow the instructions, all of them are really simple. Now, the first thing you need to do is get your supplies. Now, this is great for stretch fabrics, something like a cotton jersey or a French terry. You'll need to make sure your machine has a stretch stitch. So that can be a zigzag, a lightning bolt, or a triple straight stitch. Have a look at your manual and see what stitches you have. You'll also need to make sure you have the right needles. Something like a ballpoint stretch needle is great for stretch fabrics. And the last thing you'll need is some cord and some eyelets for the hood. Now, the first thing you have to do is cut out the pattern pieces. I put a link to a blog below which shows you how to grade the pattern to fit any body shape. When you're cutting out your pattern pieces, it's important to transfer all of the marks from the paper pattern onto your fabric. You can do that in several ways. You can cut notches with scissors, you can cut into the seam allowance, or you could use something like a wash-away pen. This will help you later when you're sewing the fabric together to make sure things are lined up. Here you can see that I'm making two Olympias. I have a French terry and a cotton lycra. I'm doing that so I can show you different ways to finish when I'm making the top. Once you've cut out your pattern pieces, we're going to start with the pocket. Laying the pocket piece flat, you're going to fold in and press the edges. The two diagonal edges are folded in at 3/4 of an inch. The top edge and two side edges are folded in at 3/8 of an inch. Leave the bottom edge unfolded. You can then hem the diagonal pocket openings. Next, you're going to lay the pocket piece, pattern side up, onto the front bodice piece. You can line it up using the notches on the pocket and on the bottom of the bodice. If you've got a heavily patterned fabric, you may want to match up the pattern on the pocket with the pattern on the bodice when you're cutting the fabric out. Next, you stitch the top edge and the two side edges, attaching the pocket to the front bodice. Next, you're going to place the front bodice piece and the back bodice piece right sides together. Now you can pin or clip the shoulders together and then just sew along the shoulder seam. This is at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here I just use a regular straight stitch because you don't need a stretch stitch here. If you have a serger or an overlocker, you can use that to neaten the edge. The next thing we're going to work on is the hood. First thing to do is make sure you've transferred the tiny dot which shows you where the grommet goes from the pattern piece to the fabric. The next thing we're going to do is add a tiny square of interfacing. You can do that simply by laying it over the dot and pressing it with an iron. This helps to make sure that the fabric doesn't slip out of the grommets when you've put them in. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can add grommets and eyelets to fabric. I bought a set which comes with a punch and a special tool that you hit with a hammer. Now, the punch you just place over the fabric at interfacing and hit with a hammer. I wouldn't recommend doing this on your sewing mat. You need quite a hard surface to be able to get through the fabric. You then use this handy tool to place the grommets through the fabric, and again you strike with a hammer. Now, once you have those eyelets in place the two hood pieces right sides together, pin and sew around the edge. Again, you can neaten here with a serger or overlocker. Once this is done, you fold in the hem of the hood by 1¼ inches. Now for the cotton lycra, I've just used a lightning bolt stitch. I left the edge raw, folded it over, and then sewed it down. It doesn't fray, so it's fine to leave that raw edge. For the French terry, I decided to just give it a neater finish with a serger first, and then folded it over and used the lightning bolt stitch to sew down the hem. Now, once you have the hem complete, you just need to overlap the front of the hood by about 3/4 of an inch and tack it in place with a basting stitch. And now comes the fun part of attaching the hood. You turn the bodice pieces the wrong way out, but you leave the hood right side out. Then simply tuck the hood inside the bodice piece. Now on the bodice pieces, I made sure that I marked the centre front and centre back. That helps when you're aligning the hood. Once you have everything lined up, you can simply pin or clip the hood to the neckline. You don't need to stretch this in place, it should just align the raw edges with the hood edge. You can then pin it and sew. I use the lightning bolt stretch stitch here, and you can also use a serger or overlocker to make sure it's nice and neat. Now you can just turn that the right side out. And there you have your hood. Now you can leave it like this, or it's optional, but you can top stitch this down if you want for a slightly neater finish. Next, we're going to finish the bodice by adding the bands. You take a front band and a back band piece, clip and pin them, and then sew together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Try not to stretch these pieces as you work with them because it can make them curl, which makes it quite fiddly to sew. Next, you're going to fold the bands in half and press. The next thing I do is lay the bodice piece out flat. I then take the band and pin or clip at the shoulder seam. Now you should have marked the notches from the pattern pieces onto your fabric. So the next thing to do is to line up the notches on your bands with the notches on your fabric, and then you can pin or clip those in place. What I do next is simply stretch the band in between the notches to match up with the fabric edge and clip or pin in place. And you do this all the way along the bodice piece. And when you're stretching the bands along the bodice, make sure you overhang the edges by 1 inch. Again, using a lightning bolt stitch and a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, sew the bands to the bodice. And again, you can use a serger or an overlocker to neaten. Once it's sewn down, snip off the excess band in line with the bottom of the bodice piece. So that's one band done, just another one to do. So repeat the same thing again on the other side. Now once that's done, give it a really good press. And as we did with the neckline, you can add an optional top stitch. Now to join the back and front body piece together at the sides, you overlap slightly and pin in place. Now there is a mark on the pattern where you should do this, but I like to play around with it. So pin it and go and try it on. See what you like, see if you like it narrower, wider, and then pin it in place where it suits you. I then tack this down with a basting stitch to make sure it doesn't move around. And then we're onto the waistband, the final piece. Place your waistband pieces right sides together. Clip or pin, and then sew along the edges with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, I turn the bodice piece inside out and have the waistband piece right side out, and then tuck in the waistband inside the bodice piece. Now what I've done here is clipped the front centre and back centre of the bodice piece, and also clipped the front centre and back centre of the waistband piece. You can then line these up and clip them easily to make sure it's nice and centred when you sew. I then simply stretch the waistband into place and add clips or pins. All that's left to do now is to sew on the waistband piece. So again, use a stretch stitch or your serger or overlocker. Once this is done, you can flip it over and add an optional top stitch. And the finishing touch is to add the cord to the hood. I use these metal aglets which you just clip over the top of the lace and then thread it through the hood. And hey presto, you have your Olympia hoodie.